Okay. Once again, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm having a really good time talking to you and everybody, and I can appreciate the enthusiasm of the people here for research and resuscitation, everything. It's very stimulating. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I got into research and how that eventually grew into the Resuscitation Institute. So when I prepared this talk, it's the first time I do something like this. What's interesting was going back a little bit to how I started. So there's some element of personal history here and how that impacted the research. First of all, this is my institution at this time. It was not that big when I joined it many, many years back. This is Rosalind Franklin University of Medicine and Science, and the name is after the British scientist who took the picture called Photo 51, which allowed Watson and Crick come up with the idea that DNA has this helix form. They went on to win the Nobel Prize, and she died sadly from ovarian cancer because she was a crystallographer, and at that time there was no awareness of the risk. But she was recognized by the people at the university about 12 years ago. This is the hospital where I work, which is a combination of a VA hospital, VA for veterans, and a Navy hospital. They integrated back in 2010, the VA hospital, with a hospital that was here at the Naval Station of Great Lakes. And this was a recent building for an incubator in which the university recognized the value of identifying faculty who have developed intellectual property that could be commercialized and bring industry. So this is the environment in which I work today. So let's go back to how I got into research. And I think I have to, first of all, recognize the importance of mentors. For me, it was absolutely instrumental, because mentors really provide you a vision of what is possible and also how to get there. And I have had several mentors in my life, but the one that influenced me the most was Professor Max Harry Weil. I don't know if some of you know him. He was really a leader in critical care, and he was one of the founding fathers of critical care medicine, and very well known. He actually trained the person who was my boss in Chile. I'm from Chile, and then I moved to the United States. And I got to meet him, and I'm going to tell you a little bit of the story. And I'm not going to go in great detail here, but he has incredible accomplishment. And what I find so fascinating now that I'm doing some work in septic shock, I can go back to the 50s, and there are ideas that we're looking today that he already thought back at that time. Perhaps one of the things that is important to recognize, he was the one who first thought it was a good idea to put people together who were at risk of having adverse event. These were surgical patients. He realized that at night there were adverse events, so they said, why don't we put them together and monitor, and was the first step towards what we all know as a critical care unit. And he did so many other things that we can discuss if you want to later. So that was Dr. Weil. And I'll tell you that I came from Chile, as I said before. I joined Dr. Weil at the same university where I am now. At that time, it was called the University of Health Sciences. Now it's Rosalind Franklin. I was already a physician in Chile, and I came and I spent 3 years working in the research laboratory without seeing a single patient. And I think that was very, very helpful in my opinion. Subsequently, I was able to do critical care medicine, and I got excited about doing a PhD because I realized I've been doing so much work in the laboratory, why shouldn't I get a PhD? My mentor, Dr. White, had a PhD, so I joined the program. Then I became faculty at the university and an ICU attending at that hospital. At that time was the VA hospital. In 1994, I earned my PhD in physiology and biophysics. And during that time, I learned how to do research in the laboratory. I was working mostly with swine models of cardiac arrest. I also worked with rat models of cardiac arrest, so it was very interesting. And the idea that you have a time in your life in which all your attention is to research is invaluable. If you are distracted with clinical, it's much more difficult. So I think that was very, very impactful for me, and I really liked it. I learned how to write papers, write grants, and to communicate research findings, and all that was under Dr. Wild's mentorship. My PhD thesis was called Myocardial Function After Resuscitation from Cardiac Arrest, and what I did basically is document in a swine model of VF-induced cardiac arrest what happened to the heart, and in 2 words, there is myocardial dysfunction that is reversible, and at that time, we document that using a pressure volume loop catheter using what's called a conductance technique, and we reported that. And that was about it. It was published back in last century, by the way, in 1996. And then I joined the hospital. I finished my work with Dr. Wild. Dr. Wild left for California, and I decided to set up my own research lab because I was very motivated, having done it already. So the fact that I was an attending work in the ICU did not really interfere with the fact that I wanted to develop my own laboratory. So at that time, I got a little money from the university. By then, it had changed the name. It was Finch University of Health Sciences. Later, it was the Rosalind Franklin. I got $20,000, not a lot of money, and I set a small laboratory, 1 room in the basement of what was called Building 1 at the VA hospital. And of course, if you do research, you want to capture data. And I was looking at what kind of data acquisition systems were available that were very expensive. And somebody introduced me to LabVIEW, and I love it. Because LabVIEW you can program. I have no idea how to write a code, but I was able to develop a 16-channel data acquisition system. And I really have fun doing that. And then I developed the data analysis package of that. And what I found so interesting, I did it from the point of view of the user, not from the engineer that is writing a code or somebody who's going to, no. So, and we use it today, except that now I have somebody else who is in charge of that. And with this system, we develop an isolated rat heart model of VF arrest, and here you can see the data. And then I thought, what am I going to do next? I thought, because I learned about post-resuscitation myocardial dysfunction, why don't we work on some approach to minimize the injury to the heart that leads to post-resuscitation myocardial dysfunction. By the time I was a research fellow, there was another doctor from this area, from Trieste, close by, and he was a research fellow. This is Dr. Fulvio Chiete, and he did an interesting work in swine models, in which he, and I helped him, of course, document a severe intramyocardial acidosis during VF, during cardiac resuscitation, and the pH would be very low, and then gradually get better. So the idea, you have ischemia, you have intense intracellular acidosis, what led to what I discussed yesterday in detail, to consider the targeting NHE1, the sodium hydrogen exchanger isoform 1. So I remember going to the library, trying to find where I'm going to put my focus, and I started to read about this, and I got really excited. I thought this has to be important for cardiac resuscitation, being aware of the severe intramyocardial acidosis. And during reperfusion, this is what I didn't discuss yesterday, reperfusion, see, the protons are going to move from inside the cell to outside. Reperfusion is going to wash them out, and it's going to intensify that exchanger. That's the reason why reperfusion injury is so detrimental on top of ischemia. And I learned about this individual here. This is Professor Maurice Karmazin. Right now, he's a retired professor at the University of Western Ontario, and he was the first to document back in 1988 that the inhibition of the sodium-hydrogen exchange was a promising intervention to ameliorate ischemia reperfusion injury. So I learned from him, and then we became very good friends. He came to our institution. I visited with him. We wrote several papers together. We have a great relationship. So that will be my second mentor in terms of the specific science. He's a great individual. Okay. Now, you cannot do research without money. Very important, by the way. So research support. So that idea that we started, looking at what happened with the heart and focus on NHE1, was apparently well received by funding institutions. So shortly thereafter, I got support from what's called the VA Merit Review System. The VA system in the United States is a big, big organization with 170 hospitals. They have their own funding mechanism. So the type of grant is called VA Merit Review System. So I got funding to the work that we were doing in the heart, myocardial protection, during cardiac arrest. Then I got another grant during ventricular fibrillation. Then I applied for funding through the NIH, specifically what's called NHLBI, National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. And in fact, what they were doing here, they had an opportunity, research opportunity for basic research in cardiac arrest. That's very unique, and I got funded for that. So that enabled me to develop a laboratory and continue to grow it. So over the years, I have been able to secure funding from different institutions. I already mentioned NIH, the VA. More recently, I got interested in hemorrhagic shock, and I got support from the Department of Defense. I have worked with industry. Aventis was the one that supported early on the work on NHE1 inhibitors. More recently, I'm going to tell you just a little bit later about ZOL. The ZOL Foundation, by the way, is a great institution that for the last 2 or 3 years is supporting young investigators. And they have more money now, so if anybody's interested, that's a great institution to request support. And it's separate from the company. So this is the ZOL Foundation. They're really committed to stimulate research in acute care medicine. Yep, and I always want to give credit to my university. From time to time, they will help me with a little bit of money to bridge when I run out of other funds and with pilot work. Very important. Over this period of time in which I got this funding, I was able to move from the VA to the university, and now we have a relatively large research area at the university. In 2010, the university recognized us as the Resuscitation Institute. That coincided with our DoD grant, by the way. We got the grant and said, okay, but now you can be a Resuscitation Institute. So we got a very nice office space, laboratory to do work in rat and pig models, and we also developed a molecular lab. Because at some point I realized that we cannot fully understand the physiology if we're not able to understand what happened at the cell level. So that was very important. I'm going to show you a little bit about that. So good support from the university to develop the Resuscitation Institute. Okay, you cannot work alone. Of course, you have to have a team. At the end, these are the people who are actually doing the work. So it's very important that you have a good research team. And in a way, believe it or not, I believe it becomes sort of your second family, because we have to maintain the support for people who are going to be with you for a long period of time. In fact, the people I have that are permanent, only 2 individuals, and I have a lot of other people that come and go. But those 2 individuals have been able to support them for many, many years. So part of my grant goes to support the people who work in the laboratory. And let me show you just a few of them. Susan Wang, I didn't talk much about her yesterday, but she did work in our rat model, looking at the level of sodium in the heart and the level of calcium in the mitochondria, showing the increase during ischemia reperfusion and how that can be minimized by blocking sodium entry into the cardiomyocyte. Gija is our molecular biologist who is permanent in the laboratory. Yad Ayub, who is from Jordan, British citizen, American citizens, have so many locations. He did the work in pigs, and now he's back to Chicago working with me in another project. So essentially, I have 2 permanent individuals. Gija Radhakrishnan has been with me 18 years now. She's a molecular biologist. She's a laboratory supervisor, and she does all the molecular work and keep the laboratory running. And then Alvin Bation is the one who took over all the equipment and does all the programming using LabVIEW. And I can tell you that was very important because Everything that we have done software, we have done it. We don't depend on an outside source. And we have right now developed multiple closed-loop systems to control processes in our experiment, and everything is done through LabVIEW. It's a beautiful platform. And sometimes here we have visitors. This is Dr. Maurice Karmazin, and every single person here came, except for Gija, they came and went, they learned, and went on with their lives. We like to go to meetings, and from time to time we'll have some social event. So we're having a barbecue at the place where I live with some people in the lab. All right, now let me tell you a little bit of lesson that I have learned through this journey of research. So this is what, it took me some time to organize this, but I think it was very helpful for me to go back and try to organize. One thing, let's talk about attitude. So this is what I have learned over several years. You have to be absolutely driven by your research and be prepared to work hard and overcome obstacles and setbacks. There's no compromise there. If you're not 100% committed, if you don't love what you do, you're not going to be able to do it because you're going to find multiple barriers that you have to find ways around to overcome. Never cut corners. It might seem easy at the beginning, but it's not going to work in the long term. So you have to spend enough time and effort to build a solid research foundation. Your foundation is solid. Whatever happens on top of that, you're going to be able to manage. But if it's weak, it's going to crumble. So never cut corners. I found very important, before you do anything, planning, and more planning before you start a project. I would say we spend maybe 70, 80% of the time just planning, anticipating before we go into the research lab. Because problems are unavoidable. So what you can do, identify all those that you can imagine and solve them, and then be prepared to deal with those you cannot anticipate but will unavoidably emerge. So that is another way of being more efficient in terms of dealing with situation. And from time to time, you're going to struggle with a problem, you solve it, and something beautiful is on the other side. So don't be afraid of problems, just face them straight. You might be rewarded just because of that. What else? Never take a critique personal. People are going to criticize you, so what? Listen and take what you believe to be valid. So here you take personal responsibility and build forward. Be prepared for rejection. If you get 20% success for your grant, that's wonderful. I think I get 1 out of 10 probably. And the same happened with manuscripts. So don't get disappointed when you get rejected. Look at that, get it over, and move forward. Don't waste time. The other thing I found very helpful is to keep an open mind, transparency, and I'm not afraid of sharing knowledge. Some people are concerned that you don't want to share because somebody might take that idea. I don't think so. Just share it. That's my personal belief. You're going to get more in return by being transparent. And enjoy social moments with peers, like this one. Skills. This, I believe, is a very important skill, largely unappreciated and essential. Because if you're not able to communicate effectively your research, it's very difficult to get funded, and it's very difficult to get published. And I can tell you that I think I spend more time now in writing than doing anything else. Because there are many ways by which you can communicate an idea. And I love this word, wordsmithing, meaning that you can say the same thing in 10 words or 100 words. Say it in 10 words. And that takes a lot of effort, but it pays off at the end. The other thing I have learned over the years is to master new skills. At the beginning, it's very tough because you don't know. You master that, and when you are done mastering, then you can pack it up in a little thing that you know. It's like riding a bike. It's tough to learn how to ride a bike, but you never forget. And then you move to the next one, and to the next one. So after a period of time, what happens is you have accumulated different skills. And the beauty is that they synergize. You can become very efficient over a period of time. You grow, accumulate multiple skills, and as I said before, they synergize, and you become a much more efficient individual. Team building, I think, is very important. It's good to select the right individual. Sometimes you don't know, but what are the things that I think matters is to assess the skill set of the individuals and their commitment to research. If you look to somebody who has some experience, you want to look at the past accomplishments because the future achievement is linked to that. If you have somebody who has been in the field for 20 years and they have not accomplished anything before, it's very unlikely that person is going to be successful. You hire somebody very young, you have to be much more open and look at the possibilities. I also developed this simple TNT, train and trust. You spend time with somebody new, teach them a skill, and then let it go and see how the person's going to do. So train and trust, very important because you're going to be busy with other things. And I think this is also very important. Make yourself always available, no matter what, because people are going to come to you to ask for whatever things, and you need to be ready to help. And very important, you're working for the success of each member of your team. At that time, when you have a team, it's not you, but your team, the one that needs to be successful. If they're successful, you're going to be successful. So work hard for the success of each member of your team. And continue to be a role model. People are going to look after you. So that's very important. Another thing which I think is very critical is scientific integrity. We are ultimately responsible for our work, and that is an ethical duty. Remember, some of our findings eventually are going to make it to patients. So you want to make sure that your science is solid. You believe in that, somebody might take it and do something with patients. So we have that responsibility. And the other thing is that we don't have very strong safeguard for basic science and preclinical research. So it's not difficult for somebody to just bend the curve a little bit because nobody's watching you and there's no mechanism, so you have to be able to develop your own safeguards. So what I have done over the years, number one, every time you test an intervention, make sure that the people who are doing the work have no clue what the treatment is. So make sure they're blind to the intervention being tested. The other thing we're doing is that we finish the series and then we look at all the data, all the descriptive data, and we do what's called a quality check. Something doesn't look good. What happened? Somebody entered the wrong number, whatever it is. So we want to do that quality check before breaking the code. The next step in this process is to do the statistical analysis, assigning a code to the treatment. So if you still don't know what it was, you give it an A, a B, and a C. You finish the statistic. And then when you're satisfied with the process, then you break the code. I think that gives you at least significant reassurance that you have done everything possible to avoid the bias. The other thing, which I think is interesting, from time to time, you're going to find that you were wrong. Your hypothesis didn't work. You may have a negative study or something that's just the opposite. So here are 3 examples. One, we wanted to look at vitamin C as for cardiac resuscitation to minimize oxidative injury. It didn't work. We're even more detrimental. So we published that. At some point, we got excited about estrogen because estrogen activates very similar pathways as erythropoietin, and this work on estrogen in the setting of hemorrhagic shock. So we did it. We didn't find anything. And this is another one in which it's not a negative study. This was Yad Ayub. He was doing a PhD with me. We're looking at the opening of the mitochondrial permeability transition port, MPTP, which happened during ischemia reperfusion. And on top of that, we wanted to see whether cyclosporin A would be beneficial, and we didn't see anything. And it was interesting because there was another clinical study completed a few years ago in which they used cyclosporin A, and it was a negative study. And in our rat model, we were not able to see any beneficial effect by giving cyclosporin A. From time to time, you're going to have opportunities. I think being at the bedside is very helpful because if you are interacting daily with patients, you know exactly what matters more clinically, and that gives you a little bit of perspective when you go to the lab and say, no, this is more important. So your basic science or preclinical work will be directed towards something that has clinical value. I find very interesting. And the other thing, which I like this one, and I took this quote, I found it here from Louis Pasteur. In the fields of observation, chance favors only the prepared mind. Another term is serendipity, a chance for the prepared mind. And I'll tell you the story here. What happened to us is our cyclophilin D story. Many years back, because of this mitochondrial permeability transition pore, science indicated that having a low level of cyclophilin D would make more difficult for that pore to open. And we wanted to test that in our rat model, adult rats, because it's better to do CPR in rats than in mice. So we couldn't use a knockout mice for that. So we worked with a professor from Mount Sinai in New York, Dr. Roger Hajar, who had developed techniques to alter gene expression. So we're working on a technique to knock out cyclophilin D in a rat model. And before that, we did work in cardiomyoblast. But to our surprise and despair at the beginning, cell died instead of being more resistant when we knock out cyclophilin D. So it didn't make any sense. So Gija was doing that work, Gija Radhakrishnan, my molecular biologist. I said, wait, why don't you find out what other functions cyclophilins in general have? So she came back and said, okay, all this. And there was one interesting, is the interaction with transcription factors. Cyclophilin D is a nuclear protein that gets directed to the mitochondrial matrix, and it stays there. So nobody has published that. And we said, what if cyclophilin D interacts with mitochondrial transcription factor? And we found that it interacts with 2 of 3. And if you knock out cyclophilin D, there's a decrease in the expression of the subunits of electron transport complexes. So oxidative phosphorylation is reduced. And we published that here in FASEB in 2015, and then we went on to get 3 grants for that work. So that was serendipity, and we built on that. So let me finish by telling you what are we doing now in terms of research. Number 1, as I said before, cardiac resuscitation has been an important topic. We talked about NH1 inhibitors. We talked about erythropoietin as an agent that could protect mitochondria when given during cardiac resuscitation. And I learned something very interesting, and we got a grant to study that. Glyphosate, also known as SGLT2 inhibitor for diabetes, and now we know that also help with heart failure. It seems to somehow inhibit NH1, so we start working on that, and that's part of our ongoing research, whether we can use one of the glyphosate, empagliflozin, for example, for cardiac resuscitation. And this is something that I have not talked. I'm going to just go very, very brief. We talked yesterday with Johan, is the real-time analysis of the VF waveform using what's called AMSA, amplitude spectral area, which is the analysis of the VF waveform in the frequency domain that give you one number, and that number tells you the strength of the VF waveform and the likelihood that the shock is going to be successful. So why shock a heart when there's a low probability of success? So we developed an entire protocol to decide when to give a shock based on the AMSA value, and that we've been working on this for the last 3 or 4 years. The other area that we got interested was on hemorrhagic shock, and we got support from the Department of Defense. So we looked at vasopressin, turned out to be very effective in terms of preventing death from severe bleeding in a swine model, and we published that. We recently added a component of traumatic brain injury to the hemorrhagic shock model, and this is something that we're very excited. I don't know if anybody has heard about Centaquine or Centaquin. It's an alpha-2 agonist peripheral that increases venous tone. So we propose, we don't have the funding yet, to look at that for hemorrhagic shock. And then here, septic shock is an area of research. We're developing a swine model of septic shock. And the work on cyclophilin D led us to another work in intact mice model that we can discuss afterward. So finally, this is the institution I already mentioned where we do our work, and we're open for business and for developing collaborations with anybody who's interested in this field of acute care medicine. Thank you.